beautiful. It's just beautiful. Bike Blogger here. Today we're going to talk about expansion plugs. These things go inside the carbon steerer of your carbon fiber bike. So an expansion plug is basically a bunch of wedges that expand outward. You got two bolts. You got the headset top cap bolt, and then you got another bolt, a bigger bolt, inside the expansion plug here. So I'm going to take a 5mm hex wrench or Allen key, and I'm going to remove the top cap bolt from the expansion plug. So you can see here I got a bolt in the top cap, and then I have the expansion plug right here. It has a 6mm bolt in it, so I need a 6mm hex key. Using the 6mm hex key, I can expand or contract this plug. So if I loosen it, it will contract. If I tighten it, it will expand. And I want to adjust this big bolt here such that the wedges press fit into the carbon steerer tube. So one thing about the expansion plug, expansion bolt, this big bolt, you can see it's got some Loctite on it. That came from the factory. That's because you don't really want this bolt loosening on you. So it's always good to put a little thread locker on this big bolt here. Alright, here we go. We got our expansion plug. The side with the bolt head is the side that faces up. So let's go ahead and stick it in here. Should be press fit. Just push it down. Just tight enough. You see there that it actually fell down through because it was too loose. So I can take my Allen key and I can connect with that bolt head and then push against the side of the steerer tube, and I can slowly pull it back out in case you drop it down there. So let's tighten this a little further. Now let's press it down. You want it basically flush with the top here, with the bolt head with the top of the steerer tube there. So let me tighten it a little further. And then we'll push it down a little more. It doesn't need to be super tight just yet until we get it just right here. Flush with pretty much the top of the steerer tube there. That's fine. And tighten it down a little more. Now, considering this is a carbon fiber fork steerer tube, you want to be careful when you tighten this down. However, some manufacturers like FSA recommend between 6 and 9 Newton meters, so that's more than the average of 4 to 5 Newton meters on carbon fiber components. I'm guessing that's because it's kind of a concentric load all the way around evenly because of these wedges expanding out. So just make sure you tighten this down to, let's say 5 to 6 Newton meters, maybe more. It depends. Check the manufacturer of your bicycle. All right, let's check out this scenario. Headset spacers, stem. There's a gap there between the top of the stem and the top of the steerer tube there. Expansion plug fits inside the steerer tube. This would work probably just fine on a aluminum or steel fork steerer tube. Carbon can crack though easily if you overstress it. So this would not be ideal because this top bolt is above the steerer tube. And again, the steerer tube is reinforced with the expansion plug. So what could I do? Again, another way of checking it. I can take my headset top cap, place it here. You see there's a gap because the bottom of the headset top cap is hitting the bolt there. So how do I fix that? That's a whole separate issue. Well, what I could do is I could take a headset spacer, let me show you there, like this. There we go. And that takes up the difference. You see? So now it's not, now the headset top cap is not hitting the bolt there. However, that does nothing for this stem clamp bolt. It still can be crushing the steerer tube. So two separate issues. Very important though, these bolts need to be overlapping the expansion plug. So we need to fix this somehow. And really, the only way that can be done is by lowering the stem, because you know I'm at the peak right now on the fork steer. I can't make the tube longer, and I can't bring the expansion plug up above the tube because that's kind of defeating the purpose. So I need to bring the stem down. That's really my only option, so I can get these stem bolts overlapping the expansion plug. So to move the stem down, I need to take off a spacer from below the stem. Now I'll put a smaller spacer that's not as deep, not as thick. I'll put a skinnier spacer down there, like this one here. So slide that on. Now I'll put the stem back on. Now always when you're putting the stem on, make sure you're pushing this whole assembly down. Make sure this, this headset dust cap here is, completely down flush with the head tube here. You want this all pushed down flush so you can make sure it's down all the way so you can get in, so you know accurately what's going on here. Really, you need everything down flush. You can, not very easily move the headset spacers. That'll let you know you got everything pushed down. So now you can see stem bolt, and here's the top of the steer tube. These bolts are completely now overlapping with the expansion plug in here. I have a 50mm expansion plug, by the way. If you're going to have a bunch of spacers on top, make sure you have a long enough expansion plug. A lot of them are only about 25mm or so. Here's another expansion plug. This came with the bike. Mine is quite a bit longer. It's probably about 30% longer. So try checking for what I use is or what I'm using here. I'm using a Shimano Pro carbon gap cap. It's the 50mm version, the longer version, just to be extra safe. It doesn't need to be any longer than enough to overlap with these bolts. It just depends on where you're going to put your stem. These bolts need to overlap the expansion plug. I can't stress that enough. Okay, so these bolts overlapping the expansion plug are number one important thing. Number two important thing is the top cap. This top cap cannot be the bottom of the top cap cannot be bumping into anything. So it's hitting, obviously, the expansion plug bolt here. And there's a huge gap. Well, we need to take up that gap. We'll do that with a headset spacer. So, let's see here. So here we go. I got a big old headset spacer. You can see inside here that it's not, flush with the bottom of the headset spacer, so we're good. This will work. It's just a huge headset spacer. You can try to adjust things around a little bit. It depends really on your headset top cap. If your headset top cap's as deep as this one, you're going to need a bigger headset spacer. Usually they're not this deep. This is actually pretty deep. I don't have another one handy. Usually you only need about a 3mm spacer, but I'm using like a, I don't know, what is this? Is this like 10mm? I mean, this is a huge spacer. It'll still work, but you just need to make sure you have long enough bolts and everything. But so this would be the ideal setup here. This is just for adjustment of your headset bearings, how tight they are and whatnot. These bolts are for clamping, holding on to the fork, and you don't want those coming loose, and you don't want those crushing your fork. So again, this is number one. Number two is make sure you get your adjustments set right. Like I said, obviously this isn't going to work. I need a headset spacer. And as I said before, I mean, you could have it just flush here, but how would you get this flush look going? You would basically have this top stem bolt kind of slightly above the top of the steer tube, and you could theoretically crush the top of the steer tube. So the most safe way is doing it this way with the headset top cap and the spacer on top. May not need to be this big though. Alright, so now that we got all that sorted, headset bolt. Do you put thread locker on it or not? Thread locker is used for bolts that tend to come loose. Like I said, the expansion bolt, it came with Loctite on it from the factory. This bolt did not come with Loctite from the factory, which may suggest you would install it dry. I'd probably go ahead and add some Loctite, thread locker to it, so I think I'll go ahead and do that. Alright, so I added a squirt of thread locker onto the bolt here. Let's go ahead and insert it. Okay, so remember, the expansion plug had its own bolt. We set that to, you know, 6 Newton meters or whatever is appropriate for your bike. There's 3 other bolts. Stem clamp bolt on the top, stem clamp bolt on the bottom, and the headset top cap bolt. Remember, when you're adjusting your stem, you loosen these bolts, so this is loose here, and you tighten this down just enough so that when you put on the front brake, you don't hear like knocking noise inside this assembly. And once that's set just right, then you tighten these down to the appropriate amount, which it may usually say on here like a max tightening to, like, I don't know, 5 Newton meters. Use a torque wrench, or a torque wrench for that. So okay, so we'll just finish tightening this down just enough. Again, like I said, it's not going to be super tight. It's just going to be tight enough so that I don't get, you know, a knocking noise down here. That's just your normal adjusting of your headset. Okay, so I've tightened the headset bolt there. So when I squeeze in the front brake lever and I shake the bike forward and backward, I don't hear like a knocking noise or anything. So we should be good to go there. Now for the stem clamp bolts, I put grease on them. Why would you put grease on the stem clamp bolts? Normally you put Loctite, or thread locker. This is a titanium bolt. On titanium and aluminum bolts, don't use thread locker, use grease, because they're softer material and they can round out more easily. So quick tip, use grease on your titanium and aluminum bolts. When you're tightening the stem clamp bolts, do them half and half. That is, tighten a little bit here, tighten a little bit here, then tighten a little bit here, tighten a little bit here. Do it little bit by little bit so they're evenly tightened down, so that the stresses are, you know, even, spread out among the 2 bolts, not too heavy on one bolt or another. And so go ahead and torque those down to 5 Newton meters, 4 to 5 Newton meters. That little click means I've tightened it to the appropriate torque. Alright, so that does it. That's how to install a stem on a carbon steer tube. Again, 2 points. Number 1, make sure your stem bolts overlap completely with your expansion plug inside the steer tube. And number 2, make sure there's no gap up here so you can still adjust your headset. Alright, thanks for watching. See you next time. So I'm testing out my new headset stem combo. Seems to be working okay. Really all I did was swap the expansion plug for a longer expansion plug, and now with the headset top cap on above the stem, I don't know if it's just me or it feels like the bike is stiffer, so that might be another advantage to installing a headset spacer above your stem on a carbon bike.